we react to objects, but objects are actually a specific subcategory of pattern. And so, because it also helps to explain perception. It's like, what does it mean for you to see something? Well, it means a bunch of things, but one of the things it means is, when I look at that thing, it manifests itself to me as a grippable object. I mean, that's built into the way I see it. So if you think about the way that you see that on the surface there, you can tell that it's separate from the surface because it has a bit of a shadow, and it's a different color, and it's obviously shaped for a hand, and so that thing tells you when you look at it that it's a grabbable object. Well, it's hand shaped, like a stone tool would be. And so, the things around you in the world manifest themselves as patterns of utility. That's the appropriate way to think about it. You say, well, what does this thing mean? Because that's a hard question. Well, one of the things that your eyes do, it's like, imagine you've got this representational surface at the back of your retina. It's made out of pixels, roughly speaking, right? Those are the cells. And what it does is map that pattern onto your retinal pattern. And then the retinal pattern propagates itself as a nervous pattern along your optic nerve, and then that manifests itself as a neurological pattern. And that neurological pattern manifests itself as an action pattern. And so the meaning of the object is the action pattern that is mapped onto the percept. And so what does this mean? This is what it means. You think this is a Piagetian observation. It's like one or many. One, right? Because I'm acting like it's one. But if I do this, then it's many. Why? One, two, right? They're separably manipulable entities. And so the concept of number is in fact predicated, at least in part, on the idea of singular usability. But you're mapping it. It's like, well, what is this? It's a key. Well, what does that mean? Well, I'm mapping that shape into this motion for that action. You say, well, it's not just a key. It's a weapon, right? And so that's because I've mapped it onto a different output pattern. But if you think about perception as the matching of patterns onto patterns, it makes way more sense. You can really start thinking about how perception works, because then you can also start thinking about unconscious perception. So, you know, the blindside experiments show, for example, that if you've had cortical damage, so you think you're blind, you can't see objects anymore, but I show you a picture of a frightened face, you'll show a skin conductance response to it, and you think, well, how the hell can that happen? It's like, I have to see the face in order to infer the emotion in order to have the reaction. It's like, no, you don't. You don't need that at all. You need a pattern recognition system that maps that right onto an amygdalic output that produces physiological readiness. You don't need the perceptible entity, because, you know, you think, you see something, and then you think about the thing, and then you evaluate the thing, and then you act. It's like, you do that, but there are parts of you that don't do that at all. Way faster parts, more primordial parts. And so another example would be Darwin's trick with the snake that I told you about. He'd go to this museum that had a cobra in a glass cage. And the cobra, he'd put his face up to the glass cage, and the cobra would strike at him. And he'd go like this. And there was no way he could control that. Well, it's because the part of him that saw the snake wasn't the part that was doing this. There's a part of him that does this to snakes. That's what it does. And it's way faster than you figure to see the snake, you have to, the image is obviously the image. The pattern is portrayed on the retina, it propagates backwards. To see it, it has to be elaborated up through a very complex set of neurological connections. That takes time. And so you're dead. Well, the thing that snake means this, that's like 3 neurons. It's super fast. And so what is a snake? At that level of representation, it's like a snake is that which makes you do this. And then you could also say that at that level of representation, everything that makes you do this is the same thing, right? Because the same would be defined by the pattern that you manifest in response to that entity. So then your nervous system is layered, that's sensory layer, neurological layer, motor layer. As you become more complex, the sensory layer differentiates into the different sensory systems, and the neurological level multiplies in terms of its potential number of connections. So what happens is that you can map patterns that manifest themselves in multiply different ways, to multiple motor outputs. So you start with a fixed action pattern, which is just like the sponge reflex. What's the world to a sponge? The world is what makes you go like this or like that. That's it. That's the whole world. The sponge has compressed the entire world into pores open, pores closed. That's it. Two states. And then, well, once the nervous system gets differentiated and the senses get differentiated, so there's specialized kinds of cells, then you can detect more forms of patterns. You can produce more patterned output to that, but even more interestingly, and this is where the nervous system starts to come into play, the mapping of the pattern onto the output is no longer one-to-one. You can use the same pattern, roughly speaking, to produce all sorts of different outputs that are context dependent, because you might say, well, so, okay, I picked that up. You say, well, he picked that up. It's okay, well, what about that? You think, well, he picked it up. Well, yeah, I did, except the pattern of musculature that I used to do this is by no means identical to the pattern of musculature that I used to do that, right? I mean, the fact that the orientation is different is actually extraordinarily important. So well, my point is that with sufficient nervous complexity, you can take the same thing, so to speak, and map it all sorts of different ways, and human beings are unbelievably good at that. Okay, so now go back to when things were simple. So there's single-celled organisms, we'll say, and then they start to differentiate to some degree, and they start to propagate, and so then the environment starts to shift, because the fact of the prevalence of all of these competitors means the environment isn't exactly the same as it was when that system first evolved. New problems emerge, and so then there's selection pressure on those creatures to diversify to some degree, and then the diversification produces a transformation in the environment, and then there's pressure on those new entities to diversify some more, and so you get this weird bootstrapping process. Maybe the environment is one thing when there's 10 of you, but a completely different thing when there's 1,000 of you. Right, so just sheer multiplication is going to transform the environment, and so then because the environment has now become more complex than it was, there's selection pressure to produce diversification in the underlying organisms, and that took a long time to get off the ground. Like, there were single-celled organisms for a huge span of history. I mean, if you look at evolutionary history, the amount of time that there were single-celled organisms is far longer than the time that there's been since there were multi-celled organisms. It's like Moore's law, you know, the law that governs the increase in computational power. You can trace that back to about the year 1400, something like that. So it's been going on for a very long time. And maybe you could make the same case from an evolutionary perspective. It's like the flat part of the curve is really long, but once it starts to move up, it starts to move up really fast, and obviously that's the position that we're in now. So single-celled organisms for a long time. Then they started to diversify, and then you could imagine, well, from the single-celled organism you start getting multicellular organism, and then it ends up with this tripartite structure: sensory layer, nervous layer, motor layer. And then that starts to differentiate, and every time there's a differentiation, that's conserved. And that's these systems, the motivational systems. They emerged a long, long time ago as emergent solutions to emergent problems, and you've conserved all of them. I mean, you've conserved your snake reflex, which is like 3 neurons long. So that's really, really primordial, but you've conserved function at almost every temporal level. So there's parts of you that are quick and dirty, and parts of you that are slow and sophisticated. And a lot of the contents of consciousness is slow and sophisticated. So it can't help you out in an emergency. But it can do, what consciousness seems to do is take your structure, it analyzes the worlds for, let's say, mismatches between what you want and what's happening. And then it either helps you alter the world so those mismatches go away, or it turns inward and modifies the structures that you're using. So if you're playing the piano, you've got this automatized routine. It has very little to do with consciousness if you've practiced enough, and you make a mistake. You stop, and you note the mistake, and you stop, and then you slow it down, and then you practice the the new thing, and then you speed it up, then you speed it up, then you speed it up. And as you're doing that, the neural representation shrinks until you've developed this little specialized machine, and then you run that a few times, and now you can ignore it. You can look at the notes and just play, and away you go. And that's kind of what consciousness is doing all the time. You're laying out an automatized routine, and then if that doesn't produce the intended outcome, you stop, you become conscious, really, because there's nothing like an error to make you conscious. Then you do a high resolution analysis of the space in which the error emerged. You rematch your motor output, your perceptions and all of that to make that error go away, and away you go. And so your consciousness is your consciousness seems to be continually building your unconscious, your procedural unconscious. And so to some degree the purpose of consciousness is to make you functional unconsciously, right? Because that's way better. You don't want to be conscious of most things because it's just, what are you going to do? Be conscious of your digestive processes? It's like, no. If you're good at something, you hardly have to be conscious of it at all. So consciousness is something like an error detection and rectification system, something like that. And so you can say, well, you could practice being conscious, because what that means in some sense is you're always attending to your errors. And that seems to be a really intelligent thing to do if you don't take it too far and collapse yourself. Because if you're always attending to your errors, you're always improving your automated adaptability. Something like that, right? Pay attention. See if things are working out the way that you want them to. And if they're not, modify your approach, your perceptions. Okay, so you've conserved these systems. And the systems emerge to solve the problems of emergent complexity. And you end up at birth with all of these conserved systems. And so those would be proclivities that would enable you to manifest the necessary realm of behaviors in the social, natural, human environment. Something like that. So you're basically prepared for that. And we went through what those were last time. And you can break them down into self-maintenance motivations and self-propagation motivations, something like that. So, okay, now the question is, how do those manifest themselves? And that's where we can make a shift, say, from evolutionary ideas and biological ideas to narrative ideas. So, I've made the case for you that you exist within this thing. I've never figured out exactly what to call it, because you can call it a game, or you can call it a frame of reference, which is a pretty good one, or you can call it a story, or you can call it a unit of perception, but that's not exactly right, because it's more than perception. It's really what it is a micro-personality. It's your personality as it manifests itself at the highest possible resolution. That's what this is. And so if I'm, say I set myself the task of moving those keys from there to here. So my perceptual frame it's this thing. I think, well, what's the world? Everything else can be ignored. I need to make an object out of my hand, these keys, that tiny spot on the table. And my goal is to transform this pattern into that pattern. And it's a pattern because it maintains itself across time, right? It's not like smoke or a cloud, it persists. So there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. That's a pattern that's extending across time. So I have this goal, which is the transformation of this into that. And that goal, so that would be, roughly speaking, the goal is point B. But you can't just think about this as something that's a goal, because it isn't just a goal. There's a goal, which is the end state of this entire process. The end state is, I've moved the thing from here to here, I've transformed this into this, and I've done it using action. And that's a useful thing to know too. I have an abstract notion, that's my decision, that I'm going to get the world to manifest this pattern instead of this one. Okay, so that gives me my target. That's an abstraction. But when I actually do the transformation, that's not an abstraction, because now I'm using actual action, actual behavior. And so I take this abstract micro-personality, this is the part that's operating on this tiny little section of the world, I make the transformation, and as soon as I do that, another thing happens, which is I don't need that anymore, right? I move to the next one of those, whatever it happens to be. And so one of the things we're going to have to figure out is, what is the relationship between these things? Because you're always in one of them, and they're scalable. It's like when you're doing a specific action, it's really high resolution, and that's kind of where you want to be operating. When you know what you're doing, that's where you want to be operating, roughly speaking, when you're trying to do something new, but it's scalable. And so the framework, which is constructed in part from these motivational systems that emerged over evolutionary history, the framework specifies the current condition, the desired condition, and the behavioral manifestations that are necessary to make the transformation. And so you can't think about it as a drive, because instincts are often thought about as drives, or as a goal. It's not correct, because the thing actually determines your perceptions. It determines what objects manifest themselves to you in the world, or what patterns. That's another way of thinking about it. Because like when I'm looking at this, it's hard to watch your own perceptions. But when I'm looking at this, I can see that chair, but if I didn't know it was a chair, I wouldn't be able to tell by looking by my visual input. I can kind of see this one, although I really can't tell what color it is. That one's slightly clearer. This is pretty blurry here. Like I can't see my fingers if I'm looking at the keys. I can't see my fingers unless they move. And I'm very, very focused on that. So what happens is that all the rest of the world turns into a low resolution representation that vanishes on its periphery. The resolution increases as I move towards the central part of my visual field, and here it's sharp enough so that I can actually see the letters on that key. So my desire, which I'm indicating by the point of my eyes, is specifying the objects that I see and specifying their level of resolution. So you can't just call that a drive or a goal. That's not right. It's the mechanism that makes the world manifest itself to you. So that's a unbelievably crazy thing, is that the world manifests itself to you in keeping with your goals. Now that doesn't mean that you can make the world do any old thing, because it pushes back, right? It objects to you. So, but still, it's a very strange thing, that. Okay, so fine, so it specifies your perceptions, your target, the current reality, and the likely procedure that you're going to use to make all of that interrelated. But it does more than that. So we're going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. So the classic and archaic way of thinking about perception is the world's full of objects, you see the objects, you think about them, you evaluate them, then you act on them. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. First of all, the world is not made out of objects. The world is made out of, I think the world is made out of tools and obstacles. And it's because you can't not perceive the world in relationship to you. And what you perceive actually are the meaning of objects. You perceive the patterns. A tool is something like a meaningful pattern or a useful pattern. It's something like that. And so look, again, you look at, I might say to someone, describe this room. Now you're going to pick a level of description that's very particular. You're going to pick one that other human beings could understand. So it's going to be predicated on your size, for example. And so it's going to be predicated on your knowledge that that other person is a lot like you and has a lot of the same underlying structures and motivations. So, and that's an implicit predicate of your description. So we're going to say, well, it's kind of an ordinary classroom. It's got 20 rows of tables that each have 5 chairs at it, and each of them has 5 chairs. There's some posts that hold them up. There's a couple of speakers. There's a podium. There's a screen. There's some additional chairs. There's a scattering of people. There's some electronic equipment. And so you know, of course, that there's an infinite number of things I could be describing in this room, right? Like I could be describing, there's a lot of color variation in that tile. So if I look at it, I can see that it's unlike the other tiles because the light is reflecting off it. So it's got a shiny white element. There's about, God only knows, 1 million different scratches in it, each of which are unique. I can't even really tell what color it is. It kind of looks like an off grayish green. But if I was painting it, to get a reasonable representation, I'd have to have at least 6 or 7 shades of green, ranging from quite dark to almost white. And that's only if I look at it from here. If I look at it from here, well then you get the point, right? I mean, there is an infinite number of details in this room. There's an infinite number of facts in this room. That's also why I don't believe that you can derive an ought from an is. It's like, you know, that's the old Humean issue, right? You cannot derive ethical guidelines from factual knowledge. And I think the reason for that is, which facts are you going to pick? How are you going to select them? There's an infinite number of them, even in a constrained situation. So merely by attending to some and not attending to others, you're already using an ethic. Because you can't attend to one thing and not another without being ensconced in one of these value structures. Because the value structure is what determines the direction of your attention. And so you can't make the argument that you're using the infinite number of facts that are available at your disposal to govern how you're looking at the facts. You're not. That isn't what you're doing. It's not possible to do that. So what do? Well, you describe the things in the room that would be relevant to other people. Otherwise you're going to bore them to death, or they're going to think you're insane. You know, so, or an artist maybe, because an artist might do the kind of concentration on a detail that I just described, but he's obviously, or she's obviously trying to paint the thing or represent it somehow. So it's still tool-like. Well, why do you want to know that there are tables? Well, because you sit at them. Why do you want to know if there are chairs? Because you sit in them. You know, what about the screen or the camera equipment? Well, they're all usable tools. And so that's what you describe. You describe the world at the level of usable tool. Or you might also say, you know, look out for that girl who's in the third row. She's trouble. And so you might call out someone if you're describing the room, because there's somewhere in that room that if you go, you're going to get into trouble. And so those are sort of the things that seem to me to be relevant. There are tools that move you along your way, facilitators, that's another way of thinking about them, and there are obstacles that get in your way. And there's a tiny set of those, otherwise you get overwhelmed. You're not going to go anywhere where it's all obstacles, right? You don't even want, you don't want to be in that place. You want to be in a place where it's mostly this. And then there's the biggest category though. This is what's cool. This is so important. Is the biggest perceptual category is that which is not relevant at this time, because it contains everything. You know, like when you're writing on this pad, you assume the entire world around you is constant, and therefore you can ignore it. It's everything out there. All the transformations that are taking place, you turn to zero, and you just focus on maybe the space that's occupied by a single letter. Your whole world shrinks down to just that single letter, and everything else is ignored. Well, what happens if something goes wrong? This is the thing, this is why this is so important. What happens if something goes wrong? An indeterminate set of those irrelevant entities has now become relevant. That's the problem, is the invisibility disappears. And so, for example, you're all treating each other in this room right now as ignorable entities, roughly speaking. You could all be blobs from a perceptual perspective. And if you look at how you see the room, except for the person that you're focusing on, everyone else is a blob. And some of them are virtually invisible blobs. And that's fine, because you're adequately represented as a blob unless you do something that disturbs the ongoing flow of goal-directed action. Just like the gorilla thing, right? So the damn gorilla was invisible because it didn't get in the way, even though you'd think, of course, you'd see a gorilla. It's like everything that doesn't get in the way is invisible, except for that small fraction of things that you can use for your purpose. And that's how you perceive. So it's so mind-boggling, that, because it puts perception into the realm of ethics. It isn't what you'd expect. You see what you're aiming at. And you know that. You know that. You're standing on a street corner and you look up. And soon there's 10 advanced chimpanzees like you right beside you looking up to see what the hell it is that you're aiming at. Because they assume, just by watching you, that if you're focusing your perception on something and you're fixated on it, that it's relevant and important. It's tool-like, or maybe obstacle-like. It's relevant for some reason. And so we live in a landscape of relevance. And that's to me, that's an absolutely mind-boggling idea, because that is way different than living in a landscape of facts. It is not the same thing, even a little bit. And there are philosophers who've pursued that idea quite, well, I would say to quite an incredible degree. Heidegger is probably the one who's done that more than anyone else, but the 19th century pragmatists were very interested in that as well. But because the classic scientific idea is something like you perceive a universe of facts and derive conclusions and act. It's like, no, you don't. You perceive a landscape of pre-categorized relevance that's dependent on your ethic. Jesus, it's so peculiar, that. And so that brings up real questions like, what ethic best structures your perceptions? Well, that is the interesting idea as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so then we can make this a little bit more interesting, I think is the right way of thinking about it. Okay, well, so you've got tools and obstacles, but they're not dead. That's the other thing. Because we're in an ethical landscape, because we're in a motivated landscape, whether something is a tool or an obstacle actually matters to you. And we can actually define matter. Matter's a weird word because there's matter, and then there's the things that matter. And you could say the world is made out of matter, or you could say that the world is made out of things that matter. And I would say you act like the world is made out of things that matter. You might say, I don't believe that, I believe it's made out of matter. But no, you don't, because that's not how you act. It might be what you say you do, but it is not what you do. So why do things matter? Well, first of all, irrelevant things don't matter. And thank God for that, right? Because if everything mattered, it's, well, you're either in the midst of an LSD trip, or you're